Okay, let's get started. This is to be a short history of the Ramchargers. By that, I mean that the books and articles already published contain a lot of information which hopefully will not be repeated here. Instead, I'll be giving you one man's recollections of that period. Since we're all in our late 70s, perhaps a couple are in their early 80s, our memories have surely faded somewhat. Oh, I still remember my student number and the Bellinger salute we gave during the Pledge of Allegiance in kindergarten, but I'm likely to forget to pick up my wife after her doctor's appointment. What I'll be doing is describing the lives of automotive engineers in the early 50s as we banded together to construct a competition car. To my knowledge, this has not been done by anyone in that original group, though I could be wrong. If so, I hope that our memories agree. By original, I mean someone who attended the first meeting, of course. This is a time when engineers used slide rules, and the Chrysler computer, located at the Engineering Center in Highland Park, Michigan, filled a room, but had less computing power than your PC. You've been staring at the picture, so I'd better tell you just who is included. Starting on the left, it's Doug Patterson, Dick Maxwell, Maury Lysing, and Jack McPherson. I'm pretty certain I've matched names and faces after all these years. The car, of course, is the high and mighty, the real star of this epic. The car no longer exists, but a clone has been built by a young group of Chrysler employees. Those of us familiar with the original can immediately identify a picture of the clone by the reduced angle of the cones on the ends of the exhaust headers on the clone. I have no idea why a clone was built, but it has caused a number of young drag racers to have a fresh interest in history. So, how did the club get started? Well, it turns out I can give a first-hand account. 3 of us were eating lunch in the Chrysler cafeteria. Across the table from me was Herman Moser, and to my left was Barnes Daniels. We were lamenting the fact that each of us lacked the money to build a truly competitive drag car. I casually put forth the idea that if we pooled our money, we might be able to do so. Now, if it had been up to me, the Ramchargers would have lived and died in that brief statement. I'm not an organizer. Fortunately, those words fell on the right ears. I'm not even certain that Herman Moser finished his meal. He immediately started talking to others, and believe it or not, we had our first meeting in a couple of days. The club was constructed as you would expect a club to be constructed by engineers. There were committees, committee chairmen, formal reports, and, well, you get the idea. The only items missing were suits and ties. The first Detroit NHRA Nationals were held in 1959. We thought it would be appropriate if our first outing with the high and mighty would be at those same 1959 Nationals. Well, we made it, but it was down to the wire. A few of the guys, the single guys mostly, spent a lot of sleepless nights making it happen. As I recall, the work was done at the McPhersons, so Jack's wife wasn't able to keep him in the house. The rest of us got over there when our wives allowed it. The financial burden was equalized as much as possible. Of course, when something was needed during the build, I'm certain many of the guys dipped into their own pockets rather than have the purchase approved at a meeting. Each of the club members, however, were charged something like $23. Can you imagine that? $23 for a car that would soon hold both ends of the class record? But, of course, that was $1959. Those responsible for buying the original car actually did find a Plymouth, I think it was a Plymouth, from the 30s that would have fit in quite nicely with the 32 Fords that were so popular in C. Aldred. But before the deal was finished, somebody let it slip that the car was going to be used for drag racing, and that was it. The guy who owned the car thought we were going to restore it. So what you see is what we had at the end of our work. Ugly, isn't it? Well, it eventually got rear fenders and a paint job, but it was this ugly when it ran at the 59 Nationals. And we were still bolting parts on it as it went through the inspection line. By the way, that inspection crew certainly infuriated the Michigan and Ohio racers. The California cars were waved through when the drivers' helmets were well above the roll bars, but the local boys had to meet the rule book requirement or they were waved away. Anyway, the car was so funny looking that the crew of one of the other Sea Alders saw it waiting in line during the eliminations and were almost rolling on the ground in laughter. Turned out theirs was one of the cars we eliminated. The car turned 109.75 miles per hour in those 59 nationals, the meet record, which some have reported as being a new national record. Actually, both ends of the Sea Alder record continued to be held by Billy Rasmussen of Texas. It wasn't until sometime after the Nationals when the Ramchargers would claim those records. I've always had some remorse for taking those records from Billy. After all, though most of the cars in the class were Chevy-powered, Billy used a Hemi. We rationalized our class choice with the understanding that there were enough Chevys to beat for the two of us. After all, Texas was a long ways away. Here was a real attention-getter, the intake manifold. It was originally intended for use only in a dynamometer room. While certainly not a 5-minute job, it was fairly easy to change the length of the runners and then check the results on the dyno. That isn't radiator hose, by the way, though ordinary radiator hose would probably work. We connect the hose to the hot intake manifold and don't think anything about it. Some engineers got interested in the bumps which always showed up on torque curves and got to wondering if they could be moved with engine speed beneficially. I don't think the cause for the bumps was fully understood at the time. The commonly used book was one written by Phillips, but he only spoke about acoustic waves as the possible source. Acoustic waves are associated with minuscule pressure differences. If our ears were exposed to the pressure fronts associated with tuned manifold, that'd be the last sound we'd hear. Far, far worse than rock music. Only the phenomenon known as water hammer can explain that which is experienced with tuned manifolding. Simply use the appropriate gas density in the equations and the proper pressures and tuned lengths are yielded. Around Chrysler Engineering at the time, the equation bandied about was NL equals 84,000 for an intake manifold. The L was the distance in inches from the head of the intake valve to the opening into the plenum, or the opening into the atmosphere if you're working with fuel injection. The N, of course, was the engine RPM. Many years later, while working with Steve Magnanti of Hot Rod Magazine for an article, I discovered that the camshaft timing could be used to modify that simple equation for greater accuracy. Then I was able to account for all the bumps on the torque curve. The tuning on early Offenhauser engines used at Indianapolis was accomplished by hacksawing off the injector stacks an inch at a time and then welding back on the last piece when performance dropped. What they didn't realize was that if the original length had been greater, they would have discovered that a bigger bump on the torque curve. In the 60s, Peugeot introduced an engine with a lump on the intake manifold. When an automotive magazine reporter asked an engineer the reason for the lump, the engineer replied that they simply knew it was an improvement. This indicates the need for continued investigation. Perhaps some clever graduate student can work out an open channel model with water so the effects of lumps and other closed runner configurations can be easily investigated. And here we have the chassis. For you young people, this is how the family sedan was built in the 50s. The chassis was assembled in one part of the plant. The body was assembled in another. The two met in final assembly where the body was lowered onto the chassis and a couple of workers dropped in the attachment bolts. I remember thinking before I visited Dodge, Maine, that there would surely be a couple of very husky men to horse that heavy body into position and insert those bolts. There's a couple of women. The process was synchronized that well. There are a few things to note in this picture. First, the engine is sitting very high. In fact, the valve covers barely cleared the underside of the hood, or bonnet for you British blokes. All of this high and mighty was, of course, to increase rear tire loading during launch. With the slicks of today, racers, serious racers that is, keep the cars low to avoid excessive wheel stands. Slicks of the 50s were ridiculously hard. If it wasn't for difficulties like driving in the rain, you could have driven those slicks on the street for thousands of miles. Note also the coil springs at the rear. Those were, believe it or not, from a Buick. We reasoned that it was best to have a very soft rear suspension to minimize problems with drag strip surface smoothness. And it was here that we had a bit of a problem. The rear suspension was to have been a 3-link, with a telescoping upper left link to provide symmetrical loading during braking. With a 3-link, we could provide equal rear tire loading on launch with the soft Buick springs and would have had no need for what today's racers call an ARB, which is no more than a very high-rate rear sway bar. As I mentioned, we were bolting on components as the car went through the inspection line. Well, we got everything on all right, but we didn't have time to adjust the rear suspension links. We just eyeballed them into position. On the first hard launch, the driver, Doug Patterson at the 59 Nationals, found himself bicycling down the strip on his 2 left tires. The 3-link had overcompensated to the extent that the car had bounced off the 2 right side tires. A very embarrassing picture appeared on the cover of at least one car magazine. So, to satisfy the NHRA safety crew, and those of us who valued Doug's life, a bolt was put through that telescoping link, and we ran the rest of the Nationals with a symmetrical link. Now, if there had been such a thing in 1959, we would have added an ARB, for with a symmetrical rear suspension, the rear roll rate should be high compared to the front roll rate. Here's some men hard at work. The fellow toting the header is, of course, Maury Lysing, whom you saw in the first picture. I think that's Dan Mancini peering between the tubes. I can't make out the rest. Incidentally, those cones are not to help the exhaust gases to exit, but to reduce flow losses as reverse flow brings in ambient air. I just realized I haven't credited the photographers. What with computer crashes and lost CDs, I don't have most of the pictures I once had, and to make it worse, I don't really know who took what. I know I had a lot of pictures from Dick Burke, but I also had pictures from Gary Schwartz, Fred Gluckson, and Barnes Daniels. There might very well have been others, but those are the shutterbugs I remember. I had an early Polaroid, but those pictures lasted only a couple of weeks. Here's some of the group at a picnic. I couldn't begin to match the wives, but starting on the left, I recognized Tom Hoover, Dick Maxwell in the red shirt, Troy Simonson, Jack McPherson, Dick Burke, and Skip McCulley. I don't recognize the older gentleman. I don't know why Jack McPherson is in a shirt and tie. I can only guess that it was a Sunday afternoon and he came straight from church. I'm going to jump back to something I said earlier, since there might be a misunderstanding. I was talking about the misadjusted rear suspension at the 59 Nationals and how we put a bolt through the telescoping upper left link, turning it into a symmetrical 4-link. I then said that if it were available, we would have bolted on an ARB. Understand, this would have only been a quick fix for the rest of the meet, and we would have removed and sold the ARB and removed the bolt immediately after. We realized that a far better solution was to dynamically cancel the effective drive shaft torque with a 3-link, an asymmetrically adjusted 4-link, or any one of other similar solutions. Although I considered it unnecessary and argued against it at the time, I now realize that the telescoping link on a 3-link is the best solution. All others involve a load imbalance during braking, which, though unimportant if the wheels aren't locked up, might just as well be avoided. I'm not going to show pictures of all the cars owned by the club's membership. I probably shouldn't show any, since someone might be offended that I didn't choose his, but with Tom Hoover being the best known of our group, I don't think anyone would mind if I showed his engine compartment. This is the engine compartment of his daily driver, as I described the efforts of others. The club car wasn't the only NHRA national record holder. Wayne Erickson had the national records for speed and ET and C gas. Wayne's car was a 53 Dodge with a 60 thousandths over 354 Hemi engine. Though he used Hilborn throttle bodies and stacks, the rest of the fuel injection system was all Chrysler, yet to be released to production. Wayne worked in the advanced fuel metering department. He had a modest view of his work. He once told me that all he really needed was an empty Folgers coffee can with some holes punched in the bottom. Unfortunately, during the 60 Nationals at Detroit, his flywheel let go, tearing up through the shields around the housing and fuel line, resulting in the fuel, driven by a tank-mounted electric pump, to be squirted into the instrument panel, where it was ignited. Today he would have survived, but in the 60s, third-degree burns over 50% of the body resulted in death a few days later. Pete McNichol had a slew of NHRA records. I really don't know how many. And they were all with cars powered by the same engine, the 170 cube inch slant 6. Although he tried the Ferrari look, that is with 6 side draft carburetors, he discovered the best setup was the stock 4-barrel hyperpack manifold. Of course, stock engines weren't buzzed at 10,000 RPM. He helped build the Chrysler prototypes and show cars, and his workmanship showed in his street car, a 57 Thunderbird with a 392 Hemi that appeared to come from the factory. Herman Moser, our first club president, as you might expect, held the NHR E-Gas records with another 53 Dodge, this time with the original 241 Red Ram engine. As I recall, it had a more respectable-looking version of the club car intake manifold, though I might be mistaken. As for Tom's car, it was a daily driver and held the NHRA national records for C-Gas automatic. As you can see, his homemade intake manifold mounted the carburetors to the side, meaning that no two runners were of the same length. This resulted in a very smooth torque curve that so impressed upper management that they had him bring his convertible inside the gates so they could drive it. How many hot rodders could claim such an accomplishment? Here's a little-known secret regarding Tom and the new 426 Hemi. Until Tom realized that a slight rotation of the cylinder heads allowed the necessary pushrod clearance, the design included 2 pushrods and 2 rocker arms in series for each exhaust valve. No parts were made. Yes, this is a design that was used in a British engine. While no records were involved, other club members were having a lot of fun with their cars. An interesting example was Troy Simonson's 50 Dodge Wayfarer. Since he chose to run in a stock class, where only cheaters were competitive, he decided on a little cheating of his own. The original Flathead 6 was replaced with a larger Chrysler Flathead 6. Who can tell the difference? The tech inspectors were told that the rough idle was due to a bad timing chain. Bad timing chains or an Iskandarian cam? Who can tell the difference? I went with him one day and watched him blow off the 49 Oldsmobiles with their high-lift rocker arms. Lots of fun. Oh, and this was with a car with a fluid coupling mounted with the friction clutch ahead of a 3-speed. I've forgotten what Dodge called that combination. Barnes Daniels found himself in a strange position. The guy that kept him from claiming the class records was another Ramchargers. Yes, Barnes and Herman were both in E-Gas. Since Barnes' engine was a bit larger than that in the Dodge, I think it was something like 277 cubes, the smallest polysphere in the 57 Plymouth lineup, he upped the weight by running a Continental kit filled with concrete. The engine had 8, count them, 8 Carter side draft carburetors. Still, he couldn't quite catch Herman's Dodge Ram Hemi. Don't know much about Dwight Knupp. I heard something about him driving sports cars and supplying parts, but that's all I know. There were others at Chrysler who, though they weren't club members, gave us some help. There were those at Dodge who agreed to give us a 392 Hemi if we would, in exchange, do the inspection work on some returned truck engines. And there were people like George Wallace who helped me in my performance calculations. George was more interested, however, in talking sports cars with Trent Jarman. Other names pop into my head, like Bill Swan, Bowden Andrushku, Tino Iavelli, and Seto Pastonian. Now, Seto wasn't a Chrysler employee, but we saw a lot of his pickup parked near the diner rooms. Seto owned and drove a very successful AA fuel dragster and had a Gulf station a few blocks from Central Engineering. That's as far as I can take you with my memories. I went back to school for a couple more years and a few more weeks. My sister called me a professional student. Over the years, I've either taught or worked as an engineer. I retired from my last job, after retiring twice before, in which I taught a graduate-level engineering course at the University of Central Florida in vehicle dynamics with Doug and Bill Milliken's book, Race Car Vehicle Dynamics, as the text. The Millikens mention my suspension work in another of their books, Chassis Design. I'm now living in Orlando with my new bride from the Philippines, my wonderful island princess, Elsa, whom you see waving goodbye in this final picture.